Thank you so much for coming. And tonight it's also co-sponsored by the great organization Kundiman. Thank you, Kundiman. So tonight's moderator is Gina, and I have the pleasure of introducing Gina, who's on her phone at the moment. What to say about Gina, author of Gun Dealer's Daughter, and not one but two forthcoming titles set in the Filipino-American War. Aside from the fact that one can always, and tonight is no exception, power clash as good as Jimi Hendrix, guarantee that her outfit will be the best in the room. I've been in Gina's audience on several occasions. There is no better person to comment on and moderate a conversation on Filipino literature's present, past, and future. For this reader, and on behalf of PAL, I most of all appreciate the sentences Gina wrote for LA Review of Books in the piece titled Francine Prose's Problem, AKA her maybe lacking imagination. It is one of the best writings on the subject of reading, what Gina calls the hidden history of an experience of reading as an immigrant. To quote her, ambiguity and splitness are the fates of all humans. No one has a singular identity. As all of us know, as we move from one role to the next, office to subway to home to death. But the ambiguous identity of the immigrant on that subway is often visible, sometimes tragically. Most importantly, the ways of immigrant seeing are double-brained. There is a majority world that encompasses you and that you would be foolish to reject outright. And there is the world of your specific upbringing that you would also like to bring to the world. So without further ado, bring us there, Gina.
Thanks so much for coming. It's so great to see you guys. As always, you're gorgeous. It's always great to be here among beautiful people. It's my job to first introduce Joseph Legaspi, who's my great friend, also one of the most gorgeous people. Joseph O. Legaspi's latest book of poetry is Threshold, a collection which explores fluidity, boundaries, and the sense of being in between. The language of his poetry creates a full, incredible world inhabited by the reclaimed body of the poet himself. Rigoberto Gonzalez writes, these exquisite poems invite us to cross into the periphery of sanctuary and danger, farther into the rooms of family and culture, in order to find nourishment in breath, beauty, desire, and love. Legaspi was born in the Philippines, and he and his family immigrated to California when he was 12. He is the co-founder of Kundiman, so he is really someone we should all be very grateful for, an organization that serves Asian American writers. Please welcome Joseph.
Salamat, Gina. Thank you, workshop. Thank you, Pal. I love reading to a mostly Filipino audience, so this is such a treat. And when I got that email asking me to read with Elaine Castillo, I said yes. And I was telling Sophie that I have to break a dinner date to be here tonight. So thank you for having me. So knowing that I'm reading with Elaine, it was difficult and easy at the same time. Easy in that, after reading the book, a lot of my poems kind of speak to the novel, but then it's hard because now, which poems to pick. So I really kind of want to have a dialogue with her novel. So hopefully I'm selecting the right poems. So I'm just going to read a couple from Imago, a newish poem, and a couple from Threshold. Poem for my navel. First mouth where my mother first kissed me. I offer my finger to figure the depths of my separation. Gulf divide, terra incognita. Crater in the sea of tranquility. A momentary attachment, a detachment for the rest of my life. Pangea before the continental drift, an ocean subsided into white desert, a whirlpool quieted my scooped out heart depression, epicenter of my first quake where I heard my father's baritone rumbling a folk song. Mina bird, in your dark light and feathers, carry me off to a castle made of bamboo. Navel, my hallowed reminder, my dried flower, bird's nest, peach pit, poached egg cup, empty shell, scallop, my oyster pearl purse. You burn along an equator, my homeland, my Philippines I never conceive of leaving, mother, dear sustenance, my senses in the obsidian darkness, cross wires of my existence and non-existence. Ooh, snapping. Can you guys hear me okay? And this is the actual date when my family immigrated to Los Angeles from Quezon City. Departure July 30th, 1984. We were not prepared for it. America, the land cut like a massive slab of steak. Our mother did not sit us down to explain, and nothing was said over the black coffee and rice soup at mealtimes. My siblings and I approach our inevitable leaving with numb acceptance, as people do under martial law. Days prior to the date, things disappeared in the house. The display cabinet taken away by an aunt, the wedding gift chinawares in it sold, except for the blue plates and swan-shaped bowls that would not survive the journey. The rice bin was given to a family friend, knives to Uncle Leo, school uniforms, cousins, roosters divided among the men, floral fabrics for the women, dried mangoes and stale squid candies for the neighborhood children, a twin bed transported upstairs for my sister staying to complete college. That late July morning, the jeepney arrived as hired. The sun held dominion over the blinding sky. A zephyr funneled through the narrowing streets of Manila. The steady procession of well-wishers in our house did not halt. My father handing out pesos as if he was paying for our safe passage. Surrounded by luggage and boxes huge as baby elephants, we were each given a dollar bill, our first, as the jeepney drove off to take us to the airport, leaving behind a throng of onlookers waving violently, and a tearful older sister who, years later, would reenact this disappearing act. This fading scene of a rooster-lined road, of this cockfighting, banana tree lush town speeding away, lost in the kinetic gray cement and dark smoke of exhaust. So in a way, like my first real consciousness of like Filipino Americanness and our history was I visited Delano, the Agbayani village in Delano, California, where there's a convalescent home for the Manongs there. So this is actually like a follow-up poem. There's a Manong poem in Imago, and this is a poem that's going to be on my third manuscript called Manong's Lament. So it's somewhat of a persona poem, and it has an epigraph. Manong in Filipino means older brother. It also refers to the first wave of men from the Philippines who immigrated to the US in the 1920s and 30s, finding themselves displaced and relegated as migrant farm workers and laborers. Manong's Lament. We did not intend to stay and live in human-sized chicken coops in the great Central Valley. We followed every promising season with the fervor of migrating across the Pacific onto a flatness landlocked by hills, mountain ranges. Fertile or arid, depending which side we crept down under the rain shadows. Roofs of corrugated iron, scorched wood, walls insulated with burlap, we dismantled our makeshift camps in order to trail the feminine fragrance of fields, reminding us of our melon-scented mothers, the apricots of our sisters, the ripening peach harvest of our betrothed, dreamily humming lullabies in a distant archipelago. We stoop to seed earth, bending half ourselves down, our mule-hard bodies believed to be ordained for such labor. Tenders, soil plowers, worm whisperers, crouch, looking up at the sun-drenched men tall against the glaring horizon, like the Spaniards on their horses, bestial, bedeviled. We were made accustomed to work for ghosts. Still, we circled the dry summers, damp winters along the stretch of the valley. We pulled at roots and began to forget. We tilled the land, became the land. Finally, our impregnable bodies awoke into daring, collective anger that could no longer stand the burden on our spines, straightening up, erupting from our thickened, citrus-skinned souls to our blood-scabbed lips, chanting our desire to return this damned aqueduct region into snowmelt of inland sea. For ourselves, we ask for the minimum in wages and lot, to be surrounded by water again. Okay. These are all the shitty things Filipino mothers tell to their children. Lies. It's called Our Mothers. Told us if we leaned too far out the window, the devil would push us to our deaths, then drag us to hell. Scold us for going to bed with wet hair, nightmare fishes, and blindness. Under towels we hid, rubbing our heads afire. Warned us against gorging on custard apples or duhat plums or cotton fruits, which gave us the runs every time. Spanked us with their coarse palms, broom handles, and bamboo paddles for our forgivable, youthful trespasses. Cursed us. Therefore, we learned how to curse. Blasphemy piercing through our faint hearts, blossoming fearfully. And I'm going to close with another mother poem. Thank you all for coming. It's called My Mother's Suitors. The moment my mother tells me she'd fallen out of love with my father, the Santa Ana winds still for a wing-beat second, and the lemon trees shudder in the backyard, their fruits falling in a singular hush thud. It is a quiet shaking. I sit across from her at the kitchen table, a man now, new to shaving. The knowledge is no revelation to me, not a throbbing secret made flesh, not a downy egg sac of spiders. Rather, for years, this lovelessness skulks in our household like mice with bellies full of rice. How did I earn this disclosure, and why, after a slippery-fingered dinner of sweet pork sausages and sliced tomatoes swimming in fish sauce, the Santa Ana resumes its torturous blasting? My mother then speaks of past suitors, those who brought her gifts of rosewater, sugarcane, and summer melons, the jet-setters who promised her the lavish gems of Kona and Hong Kong. lovers who mastered the rumba's oceanic wave, the tempter's hip sway of the tango. It is astonishing what sustains a person, what we live on, how my mother has blossomed with age as she savors her secret history. I can't help but envision her by a window, leaning into the night as her serenading suitors gather below her, surrounded by sampaguitas, luminous children in moonlight. And thank you very much.
I go to so many of Joseph's readings because I'm a very good friend. You know, I always go. And what's interesting about Joseph and what's so beautiful is that you can, you know, like Heraclitus and the river, you can't step into the same poetry reading twice with Joseph. It's always a different reading. So it's always great. I'm going to introduce our next reader. Winner of the Palanca Poetry Prize, Luis Francia has had 5 poetry books published, including Tattered Boat, The Beauty of Ghosts, and Museum of Absences. He's won the New York the Penn Open Book Award and the Asian American Writers Literary Award for Eye of the Fish, A Personal Archipelago. In 2016, R.E. Reviews, Recollections, Reflections was awarded Manila's National Book Award for Best Essays in English. So he wins awards across oceans. Included in the Library of America's Becoming Americans, 4 Centuries of Immigrant Writing, Luis has edited or co-edited various anthologies, including Flippin', Filipinos on America. A member of the New York Writers Workshop, he has taught at City University of Hong Kong, St. Mark's Poetry Project, Ateneo de Manila University, the College of St. Benilde, Yale, and the Iowa Writers Summer Workshop. He is on faculty at NYU and at Hunter College. He writes online, The Artist Abroad for the Philippine Daily Inquirer. You can read his poems in tribute to Eric Garner in The Margins. Please welcome Luis.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to read here, in particular because there are always reference to, you know, how beautiful we are, and it's very rare that I hear that nowadays. So I'll take it anytime I hear it. So this is the Philippine edition of Americas in the Heart, and I wrote they wanted a new introduction that replaced, I think, the one by Carey McWilliams, which had been the introduction for maybe 40 years. So I'll read excerpts from it because it's rather too long to read all of it. And then I'll conclude by reading new poems that deal with the drug war in the Philippines. One can understand why Carlos Bulosan and his compatriots migrated to the US. They wished to escape the clutches of feudalism, classism, and a government that then as now was hardly responsive to the needs of the peasantry and the working class, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population. There was also the lack of land to farm or capital to start a business. All these material conditions were a breeding ground for unrest, radical ideas, and abundant despair. Perhaps the one incident that drives home the yawning abyss between the haves and the have-nots is one where a young, well-dressed, upper-middle-class girl strolls through the market where Alice, Carlos Bulosan's doppelganger, and his mother are selling their wares. Somehow offended by the mother's admiring gaze, the girl upends her basket of beans with a silk umbrella and strides off. Alice's mother gets down on her knees to pick up the beans and says repeatedly, "It is all right." Alice thinks to himself, I was one peasant who did not crawl on my knees and say, "It is all right, it is all right." He is, of course, writing this in retrospect as an adult in the United States, now painfully aware of the social causes underlying their less than exalted position. But the new world seems even worse than the old world. Alos is in effect jumping from the frying pan into the fire. On the West Coast, still in the grip of the Great Depression, this young man has no kin. He has yet to meet his brothers. No familiar cultural context in which he could seek refuge. No dogs or Filipinos allowed is a common enough sign in many establishments. Worse, he is beset by racists, exploited by labor contractors, shot at, kicked, beaten, scorned, and made to feel as though he were a criminal. Quote, I came to know afterward that in many ways it was a crime to be a Filipino in California. The immediate concern, of course, is his survival in a land that he thought would be familiar, but turns out to harbor worse privations than he suffered back in Pangasinan. At least on his native turf, he had a deeply comforting embrace of family, kin, and language. This betrayal of Alos's expectations was the natural consequence of what Renato Constantino termed the miseducation of the Filipinos. The educational system that the United States set up in its colony was a replica of its own, through which came its language, cultural traditions, and values. In short, Filipinos, alienated from their own indigenous roots, were to be recast as little brown Americans. How to escape this repressive, exploitative, and racist context? How to find, in other words, the America he has come for, to be a part of and thus transcend the conditions that keep him down? The degradation of his spirit and descent into a world of aimless work and brutality is hell. His greatest fear is that the wholesale hostility that he encounters will change him for the worse, alienate him from what renders him an individual with a name, a history, a face, someone with roots. He exclaims, please, God, don't change me in America. He is, quote, afraid of what I would do to myself and to others. It was the beast, the monster, the murderer of love and kindness that would raise its dark head to defy all that was good and beautiful in life. It was then that I would cry out for the resurrection of my childhood. Where then is this America? The title is Bulosan's answer. It is in the heart. This is the answer he has arrived at after innumerable incidents of racial violence and days of, quote, aching hunger and stifling loneliness. Every dawn was the opening of a cavern of starvation and exile from the touch of friendly hands, of friendly voices. And every hour was a blow against the senses, dulling all impulses towards decency. For a while, Alos does in fact succumb to violence and thievery, and even learns how to be a card sharp and cheat his fellow manongs out of their monies. The narrative of the various twists and turns builds to its peak when he discovers that he can write. He announces this in several passages interspersed throughout the book. As early as part 1, he flashes forward to when he's in a sanatorium in LA and he receives a letter informing him of his Kuya Luciano's death from tuberculosis, the very same sickness for which he is now confined. Quote, yes, I will be a writer and make all of you live again in my words, I sobbed. Writing is therefore his key to America. Now he can tell his story. At the same time, he can give voice to the voiceless. He can help in organizing the Filipino farm laborers. He realizes there is a difference between the physical reality known as the USA and the vision and promise that stand in contrast to that reality. America, a utopian society that requires everyone, regardless of race, color, faith, or gender, to participate in its building. At the end of part 2, Alos recalls Macario's soul-stirring paean to America. America is in the hearts of men that died for freedom. It is also in the eyes of men that are building a new world. America is a prophecy of a new society of men, of a system that knows no sorrow or strife or suffering. America is a warning to those who would try to falsify the ideals of free men. All of us, from the first Adams to the last Filipino, native born or alien, educated or illiterate, we are America. This is Bulosan's main insight, that America is a never-ending work in progress, cathedral to democracy perennially being built and rebuilt. America is not so much a physical entity with formal borders and geographical features, but a spirit of collective enterprise, a continuous process of the citizenry engaged in seeking to embody Lincoln's vision of democracy, a government by the people, of the people, and for the people. It is this democratic America that Alos has been seeking all along. And through his writing, he now knows he has a tool to forge his way into this America that is all but impossible to discern beneath the acts of violence and heart-rending poverty that suffuse the waking hours of the Manong. But it is the cumulative impact of this inhumanity that forces Alos to dig deep, refusing ultimately to succumb to numbing despair and to keep his dreams of America alive, the very same dream Martin Luther King Jr. referred to in his famous speech in the nation's capital. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. America is in the heart remains hugely relevant when anti-immigrant sentiment, never far from the surface of American life, has been rekindled along with the debate of what an American is and should be. But just as importantly, the book deserves to be read because it is also an astonishing literary work written by a man of peasant origins with little formal education in a language not at first his own, but who claimed it with an intense, unusual lyricism and a poet's depth of feeling. One may and should read Bulosan for education and indeed attain that, but the perceptive reader will also find considerable delight in having done so. Okay. Thank you. So I spent all of 2017 in Asia. The majority of time was spent teaching in Manila. And while there, of course, I was exposed, read, met people who were involved not directly, but in terms of covering the anti-drug war that the current president has unleashed on the public. And of course, the people who bear the brunt of this barbaric war are really the poor. And so I started a whole series of poems that deal with what has been happening, and I tentatively titled the series Tokhang Poems. Tokhang refers to the sound that the cops make on the door, and when you open it, bang, you're dead. So I'll read 3 poems. And this first one is called Leon, Lean in the Lane. Leon, lean in the lane with the land. He runs as fast as he can. He owns the now for now. Through rain and sun, he will have his run. He is of his time, down with the beat and the rhyme, his heart and life in sync. No need to think, he will swim and never sink. Leon, lean in the lane with the land. He runs as fast as he can. He owns the now for now. Through rain and sun, he will have his run. But the dogs with guns run as fast. And even when Leon doesn't stop, he will suffer. He will suffer on these streets that are his track and where he leaves his mark. He wishes the world to see a young buck growing up. But the dogs with guns now run faster. Leon through the alleys narrow, more a gazelle than a lion, leaps in pursuit of a glorious tomorrow. But the dogs are hunting, the dogs run faster. At his heels they bay. Leon in a corner. They bark. Leon, here is a gun. Take it and run. Young Leon hears the sky thunder. Don't pick it up, pare. Hears the sari-sari stores whisper. We are sorry. We are sorry. Into his hands the dogs thrust a gun. Pale Leon wonders, why? What have I done? I may be poor, but I am neither addict nor pusher. The dogs bark, and so do their guns. Seized by unfathomable lust, they all but lave themselves in his blood, the blood of the sacrificial lamb. Leon, the bloom of his youth is gone, the beauty of one never to be a man. Leon in the lane with the land. Leon ran as fast as he could. Bright philosopher of the streets, Leon, loved by all, was given a gun. And now he is gone. I don't normally explain a poem because I believe that should come out. But in this particular case, I make reference to the Garden of Gethsemane. For those of you who may not know it, that was the garden in which Christ spent the night before he was, that was where the Roman soldiers took him. And so this is titled Gethsemane, Manila. In the garden of Get Me Some Money, frolic the tycoons and their triggermen amidst the path strewn with 30 pieces of silver. Their guests giggle, their girls glitter, their guns bejeweled sparkle. What was once red is now black. In the garden of Get Me Some Money, a rose in bloom is a miracle, like a gazelle in a cage of hyenas. In the garden of Get Me Some Money, the poor hang as rotting fruit from skeletal trees. By whose hands was their flesh commanded? In the garden of Get Me Some Money, you and I put on our designer crowns with thorns that draw no blood, for blood has betrayed us and fled. So we are now pale copies of ourselves. Adonai Elohim, Adonai Elohim, in the name of the Godfather Aswang, and of the tattooed Manananggal, and of the hoodlum Multo, bless us Bosings for the gift of gutting, the gift of getting, the gift of forgetting, for giving the poor the kingdom of the earth, all 6 feet of it. Bless us Bosings for all these gifts which we are about to receive from the bounty hunters, through Cash, our Lord. Amen. And I will close with my brother, not my keeper. When did you, my brother, become my bludgeon? When, my brother, did my blood flow away from yours? Was my face not yours? This dark skin, our skin. These hands, our hands. Oh, my brother, the devil claiming to be our father came. Hallowed was his name, but his will to tear us apart on this earth as it is in hell. My brother, you were not my keeper, but when did you become my killer? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luis, for giving words for things that are really inexplicable and inexpressible. I'll be introducing with great pleasure our special guests for tonight. Elaine Castillo's first novel is America is Not the Heart, which follows Hero de Vera, a young Filipino woman arriving in California to live with her uncle. In her new life among her relatives, she realizes the contrast between the American dream and the reality of the 21st century as she falls in love and undergoes a series of trying dramatic turns. Jade Chang writes of America is Not the Heart, quote, "The creative accomplishments of this story are incredible. This unexpected family, this history, this perfect love story, this embrace of the sacred and the profane, the easy humor, this deeply felt humanness. Castillo was born, raised, and lives in the Bay Area, and we're in for a great treat. Welcome, Elaine.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. Yes, you do look beautiful. I'll be the fourth person to say that. Thank you, Gina, for that amazing introduction, and to Joseph and Louise. I'm a fan of everybody on this couch, so to be here now on the iconic green couch. This is my first time here at Asian American Writers Workshop, so I'm kilig. And thank you to Asian American Writers Workshop, to Kundiman, to PAL. I, again, worship at all of these altars. So to be here is really amazing, especially having I just came off a plane from Manila. I basically I was saying earlier, I'm like a hologram of myself. I'm not actually like here. So, but then to be here and to see you and to feel this energy, it really, that's buoying me up. It's keeping me alive. I think it's keeping me going. So thank you all for coming out. Okay, I'm gonna read a little bit. If I move, I think I'm gonna use this because I have a little bit of a hand tremor, so I can't carry that. Thank you. So you guys can hear me if I'm looking this way. Basically, I'm gonna read from a chapter not from our sort of main character's perspectives. Our main character's name is Hieronima de Vera, or Hero de Vera, as she's nicknamed. And I think all you need to know is that what I'm about to read is from the perspective of someone named Rosalind who's interested in Hero. And I think I'm going to jump around, so if there's a silence where it looks like I don't know where I'm going, that's because that's what it is. The first time you ate a girl out was in 1985, somewhere south of Echo Park, your first time out of the Bay since you'd arrived from Manila when you were 5. You and Jaime had more or less broken up by then, and in 3 years or so, you guys were going to go back to what you'd been at the beginning, which was friends who'd lie down in traffic for each other, beyond family, beyond lovers, more like warriors in arms, medieval in your loyalty. By the time of the breakup, you'd known you were going to have to drop out of school. It'd never been your thing, not really, even though you'd gone into it optimistically, some dumbass dream of becoming the America Nora Honor still hanging around in your heart, deathless. But you soon figured out that just because you majored in theater and always memorized your lines didn't mean anyone was going to give you any parts, at least not any good ones, and definitely not the leads. At best, you kept getting cast, again and again, as the evil witch, or as some white girl's friend with one or two kind of funny lines, or more typically as the port whore picked off right at the beginning of the play. That last one was even written by another Pinoy at San Jose State, some aspiring screenwriter who told you looked a little like Lea Salonga, only not as light. His play was knockoff Miss Saigon, but at least you got really good at primal screaming. Now you knew the technique of how to do it so that your vocal cords wouldn't be ripped to shreds the next day. That was the last thing you ever learned about acting. You moved backstage, where, it turned out, all the Pinay and Vietnamese kids had been hiding the whole time. That was how the makeup thing started, and to your surprise, you liked it even more than the acting. You started doing it on the side for neighborhood girls, debuts and cotillions, graduations, weddings, shit like that. Your theater hookups meant you knew where to find the professional makeup stores dotted around the Bay that sold stuff like Ben Nye, Cryolin, mixing mediums, and you came up with workarounds like how to add yellow pigment, sometimes food coloring, when you were desperate, to some pink as hell foundation a girl came to you bearing like a grail, convinced it was her shade. I think they don't make people in that shade. You liked it, liked the feeling of being the one to put a girl's first armor on, even though sometimes, admittedly, you didn't always like the kinds of armor you were routinely asked to provide. How to shade and lift a flat Pinoy nose, how to buff shadow around an eye to make it look bigger, how to make a heavily talc-based pink blush not look like chalk on a morena's cheeks. You pushed back on some of it, got a reputation for being stubborn, but at the end of the day, you served your community. When a client wanted a white nose, you gave her a white nose. Soon enough, word got around from Milpitas to Frisco. Rosalind Kabugao makes you look bomb. By the time you knew you were going to drop out, you were bored of the house parties, the breakdancing, hovering around with some shaved head moreno who used to put his hand down the front of your skirt in kindergarten, DJ to an audience of worshipful acolytes using equipment mostly paid for by his nurse mother. When you went to LA for the first time with some theater buddies, you ended up fucking a white girl who touched your hair too much, but like not in a sexy way, and kept saying, I wish I had Asian hair, it's so silky. It was your first orgasm with a girl, you faked it. Then you couldn't find your underwear on the floor, so you'd had to go home without it, denim chafing your ass the whole car ride.
from Los Angeles to Milpitas, where your theater buddies, the friends you'd been so desperate to make at San Jose State just to be able to gossip with people whose mothers didn't work with yours, spent most of the ride smirking at each other without looking at you. None of them lived in Milpitas. They dropped you off at home with promises to call and get together soon. You told Jaime, you dropped out of school, the buddies never called. But you never thought of packing it all in and moving up to Frisco. You never had any suburban angst. You liked the smallness of your world. The only negative was that if there were any girls who were maybe interested in putting their faces in between your legs, you never met them. Or there was an alarmingly high possibility the girls knew your family, had eaten barbecue or sung karaoke in your grandparents' restaurant, or worked in the hospital with your mom, had their house exercised by your grandma. The gift of the small world was that it was small. The curse of the small world was that it was small. Back in the Philippines, you'd been an easily possessible kid. That was the only way of putting it. It wasn't rare for children around you to be occupied every now and then by some minor encanto. Early demon possession was more common than pneumonia. But your case was probably the worst in the barrio. If you'd grown up in another type of family, richer, college educated, then maybe you would have been put in a hospital or sent to church or forbidden from going outside. If you hadn't been born on stilts above Manila Bay, the homes demolished within a year of your birth and everyone relocated to places like Santa Mesa, a concrete block along the San Juan River where Quezon City's raw sewage drifted along on its way to the Pasig, then maybe the possession thing would have become a real problem. But you were. So it wasn't. Your family and neighbors accepted with clinical detachment the existence of duende, hexes, the possibility of being fucked up from head to toe by something you couldn't see, only feel. Everyone knew what the symptoms looked like when a lowly, lonely demon with abandonment issues had a crush on you. Your grandma, the preeminent bruja of the barrio, knew most of all. She knew when the voice coming out of your throat wasn't your own. When you moaned, I feel heavy, I feel heavy. She knew how to take that foreign but familiar weight from you. She was your first doctor, the first person to tell you that you weren't special and mean it as a promise. The first person to put a cold hand on your sweating face and laugh reply to the question you mumbled into her sleep. Of course you're gonna live, stupid. Your mom didn't want anything to do with your grandma's work, refused her inheritance of herbs and demonry, and instead dove headfirst into her destiny, the other word for which was modernity. Modern women didn't rub coconut pulp and efficacent onto their neighbors and friends. Modern women didn't negotiate child custody rights with encantos. Modern women kept studying at home even when they'd gotten pregnant just out of high school. Modern women were the only kid in the barrio smart enough to get a scholarship so they could take night classes at a nearby nursing school. Modern women let their childhood friend, turned shotgun husband, drink half a bottle of Ginebra, then beat them blue almost every day until their own mother had to take them aside, look them in the eye, and declare, if you don't leave him, I'll take Rosalind and go to the States myself, with or without boy's green card or your visa, and bahala ka na sa buhay mo. It was because of your grandma that you eventually got into manga. She'd been into comics growing up and gave you a bunch of her old ones from the Philippines, things like Reina Bandita, Darna, Pobrecita, old issues of Hiwaga and Especial, so old and weathered the color had stripped off the covers. You'd read them religiously in Manila, kept reading them in California until you were about 10 or so. You only stopped because you had to focus on your studies, scrub your accent away, conjugate English verbs. But you never lost the love of them, and when a comic book shop opened in Milpitas, you and Jaime checked it out together, begged Sally to drive you even though she only had a learner's permit and was technically only supposed to drive with an adult in the car. In high school, you tried to go back to your grandma's comics just out of curiosity, but page after page swam in front of you, senseless, until your vision blurred and you had to shove the magazines away. Tagalog, the first language you'd ever spoken, and now you could barely read a sentence? It wasn't just reading. For years, you'd replied in English when your grandma talked to you, stopped understanding the teleseries and movies that your mom picked up at Magat along with pastillas and sampalok. Now you couldn't even read fucking comics? Not for the first time, your own mind terrified you. The careless black hole greediness of it, that you could leave things there thinking they were safe and then turn around and find that they'd been eaten away, gnawed on without mercy or honor so that not even the bones were left, destroyed nonchalantly by something mightier in you, something mightier than you, some big-time fucking asshole whose name was what even? Forgetting. You could forget an entire world, the person you'd been there. It scared the shit out of you. It scared the shit out of you, but not enough to go back and try and learn it all again. Most of the time, when you had the shit scared out of you, you ran. And so you ran from it, the eaten up place where your first language had been. Ran like hell. Left it for dead. You clocked Hero's hands the second time you met. Once you looked at them, really looked at them, it was pretty obvious something was fucked up there. Had been fucked up for a while, probably. You'd never broken a bone in your body, but you were pretty sure that what you were looking at was old. Both thumbs, gnarled up, knobbly, not just double jointed, fucked, like, not like an accident. Like someone had broken them, maybe. That didn't have to be it. Hero might have just had a bad fall sometime in the past couple of years, but 20 years on, you still remember the telltale signs of getting beat on, what that looked like on a woman, so when you saw Hero's hands, you thought the worst. What you thought at the time was the worst. Though later, as always, you'd realize that what you thought you knew about the worst of the world, the knowledge about life you'd stored up, tart and proud because of where you'd been born, what you'd run from, what made you, all amounted to mostly nothing, like anyone else's stupid history. It didn't make you any wiser or stronger, the way you hoped, the way you usually played it. Just made you you. The other thing that bugged you out from the beginning was how Hero didn't even look like she minded being called Hero. It was a fucking ridiculous name, ridiculous even for Pinoy nicknaming standards. So ridiculous you skipped all the way past the safety of mockery into full-blown tenderness like a sucker. You should have known then that that was the beginning, should have recognized what was in your gut, roaring up in your organs, something terminal and excruciating like the bad ending of the horror you'd been so good at playing on stage when you were 18, but you'd always been a dumbass. So you didn't even realize what you were feeling until right after Hero and Ronnie left after that first meeting, and by that time, as usual, you'd already made a fool of yourself by being yourself. The way you always were with new people, hella dramatic and flirtation, but with no real roots in it, no firm ground underneath it, the way you were with everyone. Only like a minute after Hero left the salon did you figure out that you didn't want to be the way you were with everyone, with Hero. It didn't take long for you to start giving Hero stacks and stacks of manga. You didn't realize afterwards that Hero must have figured out quick that your taste generally ran towards romance. That everything you recommended to her was mainly about girls feeling out their independence, falling in love with boys who were generally either stable and responsible from beginning to end or rude as shit at first, but then juicy soft the minute the heroine ever got into some real wildness. The stories all ended the same way. Thank God for that. You knew that Hero didn't think much of your reading habits, that she found the stories sentimental and full of cliches, was possibly even offended by some of them. Although she was polite about it, thanking you for the latest book, even if it had been patently obvious that she thought it was a pile of steaming tae, not good enough to spit on. Hero knew the kinds of stories you liked, which meant Hero thought she knew something about you. What you wanted out of love, what you wanted out of life, the things you dreamt about, the things you touched yourself to, the things that dragged you without protest into the undertow of dreamless, fearless sleep. She likes dumbass romance between boys and girls, so that's what she really wants. That was how Hero's thinking probably went. Better to give up and get the fuck out now. Caught the biggest and smartest part of you. The part whose job it was to acutely detect when you were out of your depth or when your dumbassness was approaching life-ruining levels. Okay, so you were out of your depth. The life ruin meter was wailing. That was all true. But it was too late. Too late to have your mind changed by something as minor as the truth. You didn't want a way out. You wanted a way in. Any way in would do. Thanks.
We are so, 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 so lucky to have this book, Elaine.
Oh, chill.
I think that that everyone should buy 5 of them right now. You see? I'm going to actually have only a few general questions because I'd like the audience to really move into this conversation. Some of the questions are for all of you. Some of them are just for Elaine, just to hear, just so we get in some questions about this really exciting novel that I'm so happy Filipinos have. And I'm just going to say what I said as I was reading. You just can't imagine the great joy I feel holding this book when I got it from Elda. Reading it page after page, it's such a pleasure, such a delight to have this intelligent, beautiful, powerful, magical book in our hands. It's being Filipino, not incidental, but also just incidental to the power of its art. So the first question I have is for all of you, and I wish to know, because of the different modes we've heard and the different choices of art that you have eventually made for yourselves, how did you begin writing? What pushed you? I'd like to know how different or similar your paths were. So anyone could start.
I'll start, yeah. Well, I think the first piece of writing that I'm really conscious of putting down on paper is a poem. I mean, prior to that, like any other child, I drew, and I actually kept drawing throughout, in my 20s. I was pretty all over the place. At one point, I wanted to be an artist, a visual artist. At one point, I wanted to be a fashion designer. Actually, in high school, I designed a couple of my friends, prom dresses. I should have known then that I was gay, but I didn't. And I dabbled in playwriting as well. And I actually, plays are my passion, I think still, in a way. I tell people that I'm a poet because I'm a failed playwright. But, this is like a long-winded way of saying that I actually probably wouldn't have been a writer if we didn't immigrate to the United States. I think I still have this idea in my head that I have a doppelganger in the Philippines, and I still check in with him, even to this day. He has 6 children, right? He works as a clerk in a refrigeration appliance company, which is not unlike my father. But also, I would sneak out of the house for some, male loving, So that's kind of my doppelganger. And so it's not a very literary life as well, at all. But then I have this life now that is literary. And I think moving to the United States not only offered me the doors into pursuing this life of writing, because as a child of working class immigrant, it's a luxury, right? Like going to school for an MFA in writing at NYU was a luxury, right? I actually lied to my parents that I was studying journalism, which to them it's something more kind of viable because they see broadcasters on television, and if you're in television, you must be making a lot of money. So that's their idea of journalism. But I actually ended up being a poet because I wanted to escape my family. That's why I applied to all these programs that ended up at NYU. And at the time, poetry is this thing that I can do kind of well, and got me into this program that's fully funded, and I kind of lucked out in a way. I kind of fell in love with poetry, and it's become like my life. So yeah, that's my long-winded way of responding to that.
I've seen your doppelganger, actually. Yeah. Yeah, how I got into writing, I don't know. It was just, I think, when I was in university, a friend and I were reading the literary magazine, and we said, these poems are terrible. We can do better than these. So we submitted, and they were accepted. And of course, looking back, those poems we gave were terrible as well. But they were less terrible than the terrible poems we read. And I just gravitated towards poetry because there are fewer words, and I'm basically a lazy person, And I admire novelists who build like this incredible structures of 500, 600 pages, and I just want one page, So, and you can do it on the subway, before you go to sleep. So it really fits my life. So it's kind of a pursuit that philosophically also, because I've written prose and I did write a short story and it was terrible. And because I kept wanting to reduce all the lines to, as few words as possible. So I realized, why fight it, just go for poetry. There's less money. Of course, as Joseph and I know. But it keeps me happy. And so there.
I mean, I think most novelists would probably say that the idea of the one page is terrifying. Like that you only have one space, don't fuck it up. No. For me, you get 400, 1,000, whatever pages to fill it out. You leave some on the side, whatever. Yeah, no, I that would terrify me. To be a short form writer would terrify me because I've tried, it didn't work. So I think writing-wise, yeah, I think probably like most writers, and I'm sure anybody who's a writer here, you come to writing because you're a reader. So as a kid, I was a very big reader, and I think at that point, I never would have said that I was gonna be a writer, because at that point, it would have been like saying, I'm like gonna be my arm, because that's how sort of just incorporated into myself and my person and the things that I sort of did every day. It was. I think at that point, I was like, oh, the thing you become is like you become a singer or something. So I think it was later, maybe high school, that I thought, oh, this thing that I'm always doing, that's probably actually the thing that I do. But I think like what Joseph was saying, I was also really conscious of writing as a particular luxury, but writing as a particular in terms of, the way writing came to me was primarily through my father, who was a massive reader, and my parents had a kind of mixed class marriage. And so, I mean, both of them, by the time I was born, my mom was a nurse, my dad was a security guard, but he had been more educated growing up. And so he had a kind of, in a sense, confident readership, a kind of facility around libraries and bookstores that, if you're poor, you don't feel that comfort there. So I'm always really conscious of the fact that the paths that led me to being a reader or a writer are really are fraught with this knowledge that's also a classed path. I was lucky enough to have access to someone who had the kind of education or sort of institutional facility that allowed books to come into my life. But aside from that, yeah, no, I think for the most part, reader first, and then gradually realizing you can do the thing that you do.
Yeah. What's so interesting because I have the opposite experience in that none of my family are artists or literary at all. And again, going back to this whole notion of like me trying to be like different for my family. It's always been I'm the middle child of 5. I'm right smack dab in the middle. So I've always been like this really odd person in my family. I've always been like a reader, even though I didn't have access to that at home. Because again, no one reads in my family. We don't even have a Bible, which is so unusual for a Filipino household. So for me, it's always this like escape, like this me trying to escape and I love my family, but like this kind of this I've had this life in my mind, and it's and I think you know, literature. You know, I think like like reading all these different stories, like alternatives for my life. I think for me was very sustaining, and I think this poetic sensibility of just having to make up things, you know, and yet also the ironic thing is that I'm considered like a narrative confessional poet, right? Because I write a lot about my family. They've become kind of my source, my subject. So there's this irony there, you know, how my parents, even though they're kind of absent in a literary sense, they become my muse in the other sense. So they feed me in that way.
It's interesting that Joseph mentions his folks because when my father passed away, my older sister discovered some poems that he had written, and we never knew that. And so he was a poet, but in secret, you know. And in a way, that's kind of symbolic, because we all have secret lives as writers. And you know, I was always wondering, was anybody else in my family literary? My mother read, but she was certainly not one given to writing. But then my uncle turned out to be quite fluent in both English and Filipino, and he did translations of English poetry into Filipino, and he was also a painter. So it was only later on in life when I figured out that my path was as a writer that I saw these correspondences in my father's family. My mother's family was completely pragmatic, you know, which was good because somebody had to go out and work and put rice on the table. And my father was kind of a dreamer as well.
You talk about, oh, sorry. You talk about books. So it's the book is called America is Not the Heart. So definitely there's that allusion to Bulosan. Just to ask the three of you, what does, and you read, and you did the introduction to Bulosan. I'm going to ask you about books, you know, books that you've, that you've entered, that made, that you would like to share with the readers that made your life, that made your art. But also, I'd like to know, this is just me, also my own curiosity, what does Bulosan mean to you? You know, in terms of when you first read Bulosan, how did he come to you? What, you know, why this title for the novel? So, books, Bulosan.
I mean, I think I came to Bulosan in the way that I think a lot of Filipino-American kids come to Bulosan. Although I didn't read him in class. I think he's required reading for some people, for high school students. I think I found him in a library. I was around, I think, 14 or so fairly early. But to be honest, the reason that the title is America is Not the Heart is not really because of some sort of grand intertextual ambition. It was really because every time I saw that title growing up, because it's been around for, you know, in your sort of consciousness as a Pinay kid, I just sort of, being Filipino, I like a pun. So I would always just say to myself, oh, America is in the heart, America isn't the heart. So because when people say America is in the heart quite fastly, it sounds like someone saying America isn't the heart, which is why the last chapter of the book actually isn't the heart with the conjunction for many different reasons. We changed it to is not the heart, but originally it really just came out of this sort of private joke with myself that ultimately then became the title. But obviously, I think, you know, we are all in some way kids of Bulosan. For me, it was significant because, first of all, it was the first Filipino book that I read that talked about Pangasinan, that talked about the kind of rural poverty that my mom came out of. I had read, you know, at that point, I think I was starting or reading quite a lot of Filipino-American writers whom I loved and still love, but a lot of it was sort of either centered in Manila or about educated sort of Manila urban sort of classes in a way that Bulosan's wasn't. And there was the kind of shock of recognition in particular that I felt there. So I think for sure he is one of the I'm the daughter of that book in the way that, all of us are the kids of Bulosan. And like kids, you can argue with your parents. Like you also have that right. I mean, there are things to contest with in his book that, the representation of women, for example. But ultimately, yeah, for sure, a forebear. Like, many other books. But I can have people, I don't
It's
know if you
funny
want me to talk
because
about
I remember I read it at home in the Philippines, but then you read it as a kid and then you don't really know it. And then I borrowed it from the Phillips Exeter Library and I forgot it at the playground because I was watching my daughter in the playground. And whatever it is, as a mom, I'm also very forgetful. So I forgot it in the playground. And I found it again. It had been burnt by the kids at Exeter. The townies, the people who hate Phillips Exeter, the townies at Exeter. So the book was burned. I had to pay for it. So I just think, just the title, I think the title alone triggers something for people. So I don't know.
Well, it's interesting because there was art here on the walls earlier by Igarta. It was, I don't know, part of it was projected. And he's a Manong, and he lived in Chinatown. And I met him in the mid-'80s, and I became very interested in the lives of the Manong. And getting an education at the Jesuit university I was at was completely Eurocentric, and so we didn't read any Philippine literary texts. And Bulosan was completely unknown to me until I got here, and I met Igarta, and he seemed to embody what Alos was about in the book. So I had read the book before meeting Igarta, but meeting Igarta gave me a different perspective because here was somebody who came at about the same time as Bulosan, but he decided to come to New York because he felt life as a farm laborer was really not a life. And he found he could draw and he could paint, and he created himself as a painter in New York. But he never forgot his roots. He was Ilocano, like Bulosan, and he was grumpy. He was a grumpy old man, but he was generous, and he rarely laughed. And every time we'd see him, we'd try to make him laugh. It was kind of like making the Virgin Mary weeping cry, and we'd say, "Hey, Igarta's laughing. That's great," So. Meeting somebody like him, because we don't have Delano in New York, so you meet Manong who live here. There was actually a community, I think, that lived in Brooklyn, veterans of the war who stayed in New York, but we never got to meet them. So Igarta was one real, so salt of the earth Manong, and I gained a deeper appreciation of the book because of meeting him.
I'm trying to remember when I first read the book. I think I read it in college, which is kind of late. And I think college is when I actually developed kind of a Filipino hyphenated Americanness, like that consciousness. When we moved to California from Manila, we actually ended up in a very Chicano neighborhood. So I went through junior high school and high school. The school was like 90% Chicano. So, the first time that I actually encountered other Asians, other Filipino and Filipino American was actually college. And I believe I visited the Manongs in Delano first. And I visited Agbayani village a few times, during my college years. It was like I went to a Jesuit university, Loyola Marymount, and we do a lot of these like goody things, we go to churches and like build playgrounds, orphanages, and so this is, for me, the most impactful, like just like you said, just meeting these men, and for the first time I felt rooted in Filipino-American history, that there was a history, right? Coming here, as a 12-year-old, I knew nothing, I mean, I thought we were the first Filipino to be in the United States. And then I was really confused because we were around Mexican Americans, that's another level of confusion. So it is, in a way, this migration is pretty traumatic, for a young person, but also very, stimulating as well. So Bulosan, for me, I think contextualize a lot of what I was experiencing at the time, with meeting the Manongs and being in Asian American organizations in college. I feel like it tied me to a lineage that to this day, I'm still trying to learn more about. So yeah, it's one of those books, Bulosan, The Woman Warrior, Liang Li's Rose, probably the first poetry book that like really struck me. So definitely, it's up there in the pantheon for me.
I mean, listening to you guys and listening to you talk about everything seems to be like a secret that's being discovered. Some secret. I mean, do you think Filipinos are queer? Queer. Do you think there's something? Do you think there's something about the Filipino? I mean, if you were to think about queer in that, in a broader sense, because the ways you talk about, this other self, this doppelganger, this, even as a Filipino, even when you're questioning class, where you always have to put yourself in this positionality of like, who am I in terms of you? Because in the Filipinos, class is so obvious and so stratified and so in your face. The issue of this, the systemic injustice that occurs there. And so, in terms of queering, the queering that is as part of the existence of the Filipino. Could you talk about that, Joseph, and then?
Well, I think also what complicates it more is this American part, right?
Yeah. This constant hybridity.
Yeah. Well, also, to growing up in the Philippines, also we felt a remove because my family also is my grandmother's white, so we're and she grew up in the Philippines and she had all these children, and we were all light skinned, and so there's already kind of I didn't understand what that meant, even growing up there. I mean, people would tell me things, oh, you guys are, you guys are mestizos, et cetera, right? So there's already that weirdness, for me and my family, and then immigrating, and being around, non-Filipinos is another querying, right? So in a way, like, I don't know even then, like, what is a Filipino? Even culturally, we're such a hybrid, I mean, there's Spanish, there's Chinese, there's Malay, and then the whole American aspect of it, and I feel like Filipinos, especially with the Americans, we have such a, what would you call this? Like kind of, yeah, like a love-hate, but also we always feel like we have to, like, bow down, like stateside is always better. So I feel like the dailiness of being a Filipino is a conundrum all the time. I think you're always kind of massaging, like the context, as you move through it. So
You're always kind of recognizing context. You know, do you want to speak to that or?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'm not sure I would just use the word queering. I do think, you know, there are obviously, we all know there are huge regions of what we would call Filipino culture that are wildly governed by heteronormativity and white supremacist heteronormativity. So I don't know if the thing I always say about Filipinos is that we're synthetic, which is to say, I mean, that sort of pushback against, you know, there's this sort of narrative that goes around, particularly, I think, of kids of my generation, diasporic kids of my generation, that we're sort of caught between two cultures, and you know, and there, I understand that sort of compulsion to frame, you know, your sort of selfhood that way, and then there's, you know, usually this kind of path. I'm going to go back to the Philippines to sort of get in touch with my roots, and I'm going to like learn to speak Tagalog fluently in order to get in touch with my roots. And my position of that has always been my roots are in the shitty strip malls of the Bay Area. And that, you know, and also that, you know, for example, to learn Tagalog fluently or Filipino fluently would be, to me, a kind of a complete affront to the fact that my parents are provinciano, that they have their own languages between them, that there is no sort of way to access this sort of supposed unqueerness or unsyntheticness, this kind of naturality. These are kinds of like, this is the kind of vocabulary that's used to describe post-colonial people, that there's something in particular that's been sort of Frankensteined about us. But I think for me, at least sort of morally and ethically, the things I'm always trying to work, for the place that I'm trying to work from is really from a place of banality, just a place of deep sort of ordinariness, a place where I'm not actually struggling to sort of identify or be classified or decipher, but that the sort of fraught, kind of fragmented, sort of ultimately, yes, synthetic place from which you issue, that's a place. It's okay to just stand in that. So I think for me, and I mean, maybe that is to some extent queer. I just think for me, the ways that I think about it are less in terms of the kind of binaries, but more in terms of a kind of, you know, tussling coherence, really.
Yeah.
We're
And
okay.
yeah, in the sense that constant seeming, it's just ordinary, the
Yeah,
complete
yeah.
ordinariness of our complete weirdness. So, do you have anything on that, Luis?
Yes.
In your complete heteronormativity?
Well, if you were to look at it like as a Marxist, you'd say that Filipinos are a synthesis. You know, we're a culmination of two different cultures. So,
Of several different, more than two, yeah.
well, yeah, but the two main ones have been the Spanish and the United States. As one writer said, I think it was Carmen Guerrero Nakpil, you know, we spent 350 years in a convent and 50 years in Hollywood. So, and there's a bit of friar in every Filipino. So to me, a lot of the debate about where do we belong kind of misses the point, you know, because nobody can tell you where you belong. You determine that. And for me, it's really a synthesis. I mean, I think you used the word synthetic. Yeah, synthetic, but it's not plastic, you know. And it's reflected in our food and in the way that we switch codes, you know, English, Filipino, or if you speak Ilocano, you also use English. So there are all these ways in which hybridity has become really part of our core. And I always see that as a synthesis. It's not like I need to be one or the other. I'm both. And I make no apologies when some days I feel, hey, I'm talagang Pinoy ako. And some days I feel like, hey man, I'm from New York, I'm really American. You know, you go to Woodside and you eat some adobo, and then you go to the Upper East Side and you have pasta, and then you have truffles. So it's like the whole mix, you know. So yeah, I mean, that's as far as I've gotten so far.
Is it usually when people are asking you what pasalubong you've brought that you're like, I'm American?
Or when I go back home, you know, it's like, hey, wala bang pasalubong? I'm poor.
It's not my clone.
Well, also this conversation kind of triggers, like, to me from the novel, like, because the novel has so many languages and, you know, dialects. So there's a lot of like miscommunication and secrets, right? Like people can actually talk to each other in front of a person, and that person not know. So there's a lot of that going on in the novel, and I think that's so.
Constantly what we do as
Yeah, that's
Filipinos.
so very Filipino in a way. Like you kind of like there are these things that you capture in the novel, and that's one of them that I am so
Rudeness
fascinated
too
about.
is part of ourselves.
Yeah.
You haven't seen somebody and one day say, "Oh, you're so fat," or "Have you been married? When did you? You're still not married. You've met the person for 2 minutes, and there are all these personal questions." It used to annoy me, but now I love it. Because it kind of brings you down to earth.
Well, also they're looking at you.
They're looking at you, yeah.
Yeah, which is something. I mean, they see you, which is too much sometimes. But so could you talk about that? About how you put this novel together? He's talking about the different worlds, all the different strands that you put together here, and what the process was. I don't know if you read the interview with her, but that there was actually the autobiographical strand too, and I find that very interesting, putting that together. It was one of the things that once I was flummoxed by that question when someone asked me, why do you never put your life in your work? And I'm thinking, how do you know? But so anyway.
Yeah, I think, well, for me, I started working on the book in the summer of 2013. So essentially, years before that, I had written this kind of if anyone's read the interview, I wrote some Greek myth fan fiction novel, which I gave up for, humanity. And then basically, I started writing past this prologue. That was the kind of prologue that just came out of me quite sort of quickly and intuitively. And it was at that point I thought, okay, well, I thought I was going to write the book either from Pas's perspective or from Ronnie's perspective. Autobiographically, I share the most details with Ronnie, for example. We grew up in Milpitas. Our parents did the same things, the same kind of working class, 90s immigrant, suburban Bay Area. It's a space and a texture that I know well. And then I try to write from it. And I mean, Emma, my agent, is here. No, she's read the 200 pages that I wrote from Ronnie's perspective, which were all just dead, just a shell on the page. There's no life in them, no oxygen in any of the words. Just, if anyone tells you that it's easy to write from a perspective that is similar to yours, tell them this story. So essentially, it was from that point that, having struggled to write from Ronnie's perspective, I in the back of my head, there was a character who was a former NPA member who was in exile. There was in my family someone who had also been part of the NPA, the New People's Army, the kind of armed communist wing of the Philippines. But I think she was quite a higher up, and I didn't want to write about a higher up. I had never met her. I didn't know anything about her story. It was just sort of stories that I'd heard about my family sort of hiding this person that planted that seed. So this is the point. I don't know if there are any writers here in the audience, but people, you think you have maybe 3, 4, 5 stories in the background, and then you realize, no, you just have the one. Because at the point I realized Hero was Ronnie's cousin, that Hero sort of entered the house in Milpitas, the kind of world opened up, which I struggled with ultimately because I was really uncomfortable with writing from Hero's perspective. She has the kind of class privilege in the Philippines that, for one thing, I don't have firsthand experience of, and also I really fucking hate. And I didn't really want to write from, the perspective. I didn't want to sort of frame the entire narrative that way. But what I did realize ultimately is that despite my wishes, writing from Pas's perspective or Ronnie's or even Rosalind's, the chapter that I read, I couldn't sustain that voice for that long just because I was super, super, super defensive of those characters. I wouldn't let any vulnerability get in the page. They wouldn't tell you anything. Anything that made them look bad, they're not talking about it. Which ultimately I always think, if you're a writer, this is the thing that I was saying in the interview also, all of your characters have blind spots. That's a given. Ultimately, I think if it's helpful in any way to go with the character who has the blind spot that actually helps your world, which is the kind of blind spots that are maybe sort of narratively serving the kind of the world that you're trying to build. So ultimately, that was how I came out with Hero. And the minute that Hero sort of was our main kind of, in a way, proxy audience character or kind of narrative perspective, then the book came.
Would you guys have questions? Do you guys have questions?
I mean, it's really easy to be the first person to ask the question, right?
Hi, thanks. Thank you guys for coming and
Hi.
for reading all your great works. This is for Elaine. I haven't read your book yet, but I just started reading the first page and I'm already entertained. So my question will be, will you be considering this book for a film adaptation?
What are you, an agent?
I wish.
You want to take a meeting?
But I mean, it has the potential. I mean, just reading the first page, I'm an avid reader, so I know. I mean, yeah.
Oh. Well, first of all, thank you for reading. You're like
First
almost
page.
my favorite type of person to talk to, because now you've read. I like people who haven't read the book, because then we just talk about anything else. But thank you for reading. Yeah, sure, of course. I think there are sort of background talks happening right now, so maybe that's something. But I don't think. I think this is something that is amorphous for any. I think anyone who's sort of maybe even like touching that world knows that that's a kind of amorphous thing, and you don't know what's going to happen. But sure, yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Hi, hi, Professor Francia. My question for you guys is, I remember back when I was taking class at Hunter, one of my professors, he was also Asian American, and he said that as a result, that a lot of, he didn't want to submit work to this workshop, unfortunately, or like spaces that are specifically Asian American oriented, because it simply serves to sort of, I guess, exotify us further in the eyes of the white establishment, supposedly. What are your thoughts on creating work that is maybe not explicitly Filipino, but rooted in sort of your identities as Filipinos?
Oh, I'm explicitly Filipino. No, I mean, don't care about the white establishment. That helps. No, I mean, ultimately, listen, I get that sort of pose, but I think it is part of a certain fraudulent discourse, which is to say that real literature is literature that transcribes to what, like the transcendent sort of universal, right? The neutral. But who are the people who get to benefit from that kind of discourse, right? Who are the people who have access to that type of labeling? It's white people. It's not. So that type of, I think in a sense, aspiring to that level of neutrality isn't something that interests me, because we know that those discourses are ones that sort of are strategically indispensable to erasing people like us, to erasing spaces like this. I don't think there's any contradiction with sort of doing a reading, at wherever, at some other bookstore, and then also sort of honoring this space here. I don't see that there's any. I mean, I think that sort of terror of exoticization or ghettoization, which is usually the very problematic term that's used, and a very revealing term, to be honest, is one that ultimately needs to be decolonized, right? I mean, I personally.
See, I told you she's our hero.
No, but like, no, sorry, I have to keep going, but I was just in Manila for, actually for the third time in my life, and it was my first time going as an adult. Going not as the daughter of someone, not going straight from airport to provinces, going as a writer. And I mean, beyond being just completely blown away by the level of literary discourse there, the engagement, the sort of social political sort of resistance, and the real beauty of the work, I think there was also the kind of understandable question, like, how did you, like, there are like untranslated Filipino words in this, and how did you do that? How did white people let you do that? And I was like, well, guys, you just have to fucking do it. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm truly sorry. I mean, also, ultimately, yes, I will put out there that I was lucky enough to have editors, and both of my US and UK editor were white, to have editors who were, ready to step up to that challenge of ultimately changing what we think literature. I mean, not to them, not like, this is not like that big a deal, it's writing. But like ultimately altering, what we consider the literary, or what, and what is considered sort of extra literary. So I think for me, those kinds of structural changes, beyond, yes, hiring more agents, of color, and editors of color, and publishers and publicists and everything of color, and not just the kind of front room of the house diversifying, but also ultimately, really sort of rethinking the way we think about what constitutes literature, what is allowed to take place, what is allowed to take place there. Is it just a place where, white middle class people live. That's not the literature that I grew up on. That's not the literature that I want to see, and it's not literature that's commensurate to our realities.
Hell yeah. Okay.
I think we have time for one more.
Hi, I'm Rose. I hesitated to ask this, but I just had the feeling that we don't have a history beyond the 350 years before the Spanish from this discussion. And I just want to bring it up. I mean, you know, is there a Wakanda? Right? I mean, and
We did that already.
you know what I'm saying?
Or,
Like, you know, when you talk about Aswang or something like that, I mean, what's the research on that in terms of what it means to be Filipino, right? And I mean, I had some information about where that came from and how, for example, I'm very interested in that from a female perspective, because the aswang is this severed female creature.
That's the Manananggal.
That's the Manananggal.
Or I think it's the same family, actually. They're
but
just different.
Quite
They're
different.
cousins.
Yeah. So, so anyway, that's just a general question I have. Language comes into it, right?
Yeah.
But also really who we are
Yeah.
as a people, not to be defined as 350 years in the convent and 50 years, and then now.
Yeah, I completely
Here.
agree. I really
Right.
hate that line. It's a line that's quite haunting, and I think it's something that needs to be dismantled. I mean, I think one of the things that, just talking about having, sorry to jump in, but having, just been in Manila and at that Philippine International Literary Festival, the thing that I was struck by was, I mean, the absolute diversity of the languages and the traditions there. There was an amazing literary panel there. About literature, the literary scene in Soc-Sargen. I don't know if people, it was a term that I wasn't even that familiar with, in Socs, which is the kind of area in South Central Mindanao, and the kinds of particular resistances that are happening there, particular literary traditions, the fight to write in vernacular, to write in Blaan, or to write in Hiligaynon, or to write in, that's not just in Soc-Sargen, but all around the Philippines. I think that knowledge is very alive. I think probably, we should interrogate how, in a way, problematic are, in terms of Philam, our sort of images or sort of sense of the Philippines might be, being at a diasporic remove, because, there are just huge swaths of sort of what we might think of as like Filipino history or Filipino lives that might not get talked about. And that was what was really exciting being there, is seeing all of it. Because they were talking about, for example, like, oh, writers from Soc-Sargen, we hate being invited to like Manila literary panels to be the token color, to be like the vernacular panel. And I was like, this is what writers of color feel in like larger white dominated literary industries. So if anything, what I would like writers here to do is just form more connections. I'm like, shoving books at people that I dragged over in my suitcase like contraband, because a lot of it is not translated and is not brought, not that many of it needs to be translated, a lot of it is in English, but some of it is in vernacular. There's not a sort of system of literary agenting in the Philippines, so it's a lot of, there's a lot of really amazing literature there from voices we haven't heard about that I think, we should work to give voice to.
It's not really new, the bringing in of different, I mean, one thing I would say about your question is that I think if we can think about it this way, our Easter Island statuary is words. The things that our archaeology lies in our language, I think. So if Aswang is there, Aswang is there. There is some, and as one of my brothers used to say, only the Philippines has malunggay. This concept of this indigenous that language is our indigenizing self. But the issue, I mean, Rizal was already doing this. I mean, he had Chabacano, he had the opening section of Tatakut, the chapter in El Filibusterismo was Chabacano, Spanish, Tagalog, etc. So he was already recognizing, and he problematizes language as the plot of filibusterismo, which is a weird idea. It's all about language, and I think that's one place to look at in terms of that recognition uh, there's something beyond, you know, and it's a historical thing. Language is a historical thing. So when we examine our language, I think we can find very interesting complexities and archaeologies of ourselves. I think so.
No, I agree, but I think most of the stories I grew up with were orally handed down and not to be seen anywhere in written form. And I think, you know, anyway, so that's of interest to me because I still remember them. And I'm not
yes.
sure, sorry,
Go ahead.
I'm just not sure where that literary sort of, where that is and how we, you know,
It may not be written. It may be, I mean, just as you say,
huge
just the
oral traditions,
puns.
yeah.
Just the fact the Philippines just are punning all the time. You know, your title is a pun, and that we just work. Our ordinariness lies in that weird artistry with language.
Well, I'd like to kind of give the context in which that statement was made. 350 years in Hollywood. It wasn't meant to indicate that there was no history, but how did we become a nation? And before the advent of colonialism, we were basically 7,100 islands. You had Islam coming in from the south through Borneo and Indonesia, and all these islands had different kingdoms. You had the Hindu influence in Visayas, which is why it's called Visayas, Sri Vijaya Empire. And in the north, you had the tribes that didn't really know one another. So it's really a way of stating what transpired under colonialism. It's not to say that this was good or that there was nothing there. In fact, when the Spanish came, the friars destroyed a lot of the written records in the Bicol region. Okay, and then the missionaries in the Cordilleras got the Igorots to destroy a lot of their erotic art. If you go to Baguio, the Benca Museum, there's a room that's filled with erotic art carved by the Igorots that date back, you know, centuries, and it's great. You know, so there's a whole history there that existed before colonial history, okay? But that, you know, the way writers think, it's a way of grabbing your attention. I mean, look at the word Philippines. Where does it come from? Filipinas, named after Prince Philip. And in referring to Rizal, there's a whole comic scene where the Guardia Civil captain tells his wife, it's not Filipinas, you know, it's Filipinas. She says, but it was Felipe. So language is important, and he wrote in Spanish, by the way, Rizal. And he was seen as the father or one of the instigators of the revolution. So yes, it's a problematic history, but it's there. You know, and what we need to do is, there is no Wakanda, but there is a collection of different cultures that existed in that archipelago. I mean, there's the oldest inscription that was found was in Baybayin, you know, the old system of writing, which you still find in Mindoro. So there's a lot of literature that's been written about the pre-colonial history. So if you're interested, certainly I can give you a number of texts to consult.
And you can also read America is Not the Heart. Thank you.